From the APR Creation Studio, this is Jason Staples, as always, bringing you Unconquered with Doc Staples. This podcast brought to you by EPR Creations, bringing you the best of internet marketing and website development for an affordable price, by Shenandoah Real Estate in the Research Triangle of North Carolina, by Luis Marquez of Momentum Realty in Jacksonville, Florida, Ponte Vedra, and Nocatee, and by Garage Makeovers, the #1 garage remodeling company in South Florida. And then, of course, we cannot forget Justin Galloway of Benchmark Mortgage. If you need a mortgage and you live in Florida, Alabama, Tennessee, or Kentucky, you need to give him a holler. Get a boutique experience, making sure that you get the absolute best mortgage rates and service that's going to simplify that process. Let him know you heard about him from the Unconquered podcast with Doc Staples. You'll be glad you did. All right, well, the long wait is over. It's time. It's time we go ahead and get to our full season preview. I've not done a position-by-position breakdown on everything this year. Time sort of got away from that, and honestly, I've gone through those positions very much over the course of the last few episodes as I've talked about fixing the problems. So we're just going to go ahead and move forward and look at the actual season and what we might be able to expect this season. But, I'm going to go ahead and preface this up front. And, I talked about this on the Burnham Brothers podcast not long ago. I have the privilege this year of covering maybe the two biggest mysteries in terms of the preseason in all of college football. That is North Carolina with Bill Belichick. Nobody knows how good they're going to be. Nobody knows what they're going to look like at this point. They've got 60 new players on that roster, 61, I think. And it's just a total mystery what they're going to look like. It's just a completely different team. They're starting 9.5 first-year transfers. There's one guy that's a returnee who was a backup last year who's now starting, but he's sort of sharing that role. Looks like it's going to happen on defense. 9.5 essentially new transfer starters on defense for them. And then the offensive side, I think they've got 4 or 5 guys that were on the roster last year that are starting. And it's wild. And Florida State is no more predictable than that team. And we saw it last year. Nobody, not a single soul, not even Paul Feinbaum, who even a blind, biased squirrel finds a nut once in a while. And Feinbaum in the preseason last year was adamant that Florida State was the one top 10 team that was just, they were going to collapse this next year and they were going to finish unranked. And turned out he was right. But even Feinbaum did not expect Florida State to go 2-10 last year, coming off 13-1. Not a single soul in the world, I think, expected that. So you think about that. 2023, they significantly overachieved expectations. 2022, they overachieved expectations. And then 2024, the bottom fell out in historic fashion. And we just don't know what to expect coming into this year because, after what happened last year, are they going to be closer to that? Or are they going to be closer to the trajectory that they were on in 2022 and 2023? I don't think we're going to see 2023, but 2022, in terms of the outcome and the results, doesn't seem that far out of the question, as we talked about a couple shows ago. So very, very unpredictable season. So I want to preface that with this, that, we're kind of taking a more of a fool's errand than usual on this show in terms of trying to assess what we're looking at coming into this year. That said, last year, we did talk about some of the concerns that we had, and that, if all these things go wrong at the same time, then that could be really bad. But odds are they at least some of this stuff will work. And we thought that at least they were going to be able to run the football well enough to be able to set some things up on offense and survive, even if they weren't world beaters in other areas. And it turned out that was they lacked the straw to stir the drink at all up front, and that was that. So I do think, actually, in some ways, with the benefit of hindsight, this year's team, there are certain things that are more predictable than what we saw last year. Last year was unpredictable because last year's program was still hung over from something. And I don't think we can emphasize this enough. And I know some people, especially outside the Florida State bubble, are just tired of Florida State fans bringing this up and tired of media bringing this up. But at the end of the day, I don't think we can overstate how much the travesty, the snub of the 2023 team affected the Florida State program going into 2024 and how much that just submarined everything. And we've talked about that. We talked about it a bunch in terms of how that impacted Mike Norvell's ability to coach hard and the overall accountability in the team. I think it affected the way that they targeted certain players, that they went after guys that were maybe higher ceiling type athletes, but weren't as good a fit in terms of some of the culture stuff, because frankly, they weren't really planning on running it back the same way. And then when that happened, they, I think, changed tack and it backfired badly. Whereas I think last year kind of flushed that out of the system. And now you have a bunch of guys, the guys who are left, who are angry and ready to try to prove themselves. And then they brought in a bunch of guys that I think in terms of the culture, I think the one thing that we can be confident of, the one thing that we can know is the most predictable thing about this year's team is that this year's team is going to fight and claw in ways that last year's team didn't. And that's what we thought going into last year was the biggest question. I mean, even going back to last January, not January 2025, but January 2024, we talked about that, about like the real question with this team is, are they going to be able to get them to buy into the climb again? Are they going to get them to buy in the way that they need to be successful? And the answer was no. And that's why you have a bunch of assistant coaches that are different. And the one thing that I think we can be confident of this season, the one thing that we can predict, happens to be the one thing that going into the last season, we felt like we couldn't predict. And that is, will this team play hard? Will they have the kind of culture that they need to have? And I think this year's team, the answer to that is going to be a yes. This year's team, especially on defense and on the line of scrimmage, they're going to play hard and they're going to play physical football. Going to get back to that identity that you saw in 2022, in 2023. You saw some in 2021, but they, sort of ran out of bodies. And I think we're going to see probably a year closer to the 2021, 2022 situation. You go back to 2021 and that opening loss to Notre Dame. That I think is a very comparable situation to what we're looking at in terms of the opener for the 2025 season, right? You had the number 8 Notre Dame team at Florida State against an unranked Florida State that had been pretty bad the year before. That was the COVID season the year before. And Florida State took that number 8 Notre Dame team into overtime, gave them all they could handle, very nearly beat them. And over the course of that 2021 season, which, by the way, that first month, Florida State started 0-4. They had the loss in overtime in the opener against Notre Dame. Then they lost to Jacksonville State on that inexcusable bust and just a very poor game there. Then they lost on the road at Wake Forest, that number 15 Wake Forest team. Then lost to Louisville. And then they turned the corner. And they ended the year on a tear. They beat Syracuse. They beat UNC on the road, dominated UMass, competed into the fourth quarter against number 14 Clemson, lost on the road to NC State, beat Miami, beat Boston College, lost close to Florida, and then won the bowl game. And that finally set the table for the 2022 season, where they won the opener against LSU. And then from that point forward, the program really seemed like they had permanently turned the corner under Mike Norvell up until the travesty, up until the snub. And I think there's a lot of similarities coming into this season between sort of that 2021 and 2022 season. I think they're closer to the 2022 season in that there's more of a defined identity and they know who their frontline guys are. If you remember at the beginning of 2021, they still didn't know kind of what they were going to be or who they had. Jordan Travis was not really established as the starter. I mean, they were still they were still trotting Milton out there on 1.5 legs, right? So you had Mackenzie Milton going out there in that first month and not being able to really do the things that he needed to do. And it was really by the end of 2021 that they had established that was Jordan Travis's team and it would be going forward. And that became one of the questions going into 2022 is, can a Jordan Travis led team be good enough offensively? Well, this year they know what they're going to be in terms of the type of offense they're going to run, who the quarterback's going to be. They know who their guys are up front. They know who the frontline receivers and backs are going to be. It's different in that respect compared to 2021 and a little closer to 22. So somewhere between those, I think, is what we're going to look at in terms of the overall level of play from this year's Florida State team. And like I said, I think there's a lot of similarities with that opener. You look at the opener this year, and who does Florida State open with? The number 8 team in the country at home, just like number 8 Notre Dame that year. This year's number 8 team is Alabama. And, I think if you put truth serum into Mike Norvell, he would prefer not to have to play this game. I think he would rather not have this game on the schedule. He certainly would prefer not to open with this game. But at the end of the day, Florida State is going to open with this game. And let's just go ahead and get into it in terms of the actual season preview from here, taking it game by game. And I'm not going to do a full breakdown here because obviously I'm going to have the breakdown as best I can of Alabama, which also has its fair share of question marks. And I think this year, by the way, in 2025, has the most teams with question marks of any season really since COVID. And largely because you had so many veterans and a lot of quarterbacks that were veterans at a lot of these places. And there's a lot of question marks across the country, a lot of programs right now that don't really know how good they're going to be because of the combination of quarterback movement, veterans sort of having moved on finally, or this is really the last year of all the extra COVID years and all that, which really changed the game the last couple years, last 4 years. Now, all of a sudden, you're starting to get some of that filtered out. And so you're getting younger players that are starting. You look at Ohio State, they're starting a redshirt freshman at quarterback. It's been a while since we saw that sort of thing. Well, Alabama has a quarterback that's waited his turn behind Jalen Milroe for a good while. And they also have a number of questions after finishing the season the way that they did last year and missing the playoff and really finishing with a couple of major problems, big duds offensively against a very good defense in OU and a very good defense in Michigan. Really weren't able to get going against either team. The question then is, how good are they actually going to be this year? Are they going to be they're by overall blue chip ratio and talent on the roster, they're top 2, top 3 roster in the United States. The question is, are all those pieces and is their identity a match to the kind of football that they want to play? And is the personnel a match to the kind of football that they want to play? And then the other big question is, how good is Ty Simpson going to be at quarterback? Well, I don't want to belabor this point, but I do think Alabama has questions as well coming into this game. Just a lot fewer than Florida State because they've got a lot more depth. And actually, you know what? We're going to have to go ahead and address the depth chart before we even move into the schedule. So let's actually do that. Let's look at the depth chart and what that may signal to us about what this team is and what they're going to be before we get to assessing our win totals, our projections for each game, and then our win total for the season. Let's go ahead and talk about that. So first of all, Florida State released its depth chart on Monday. And it's been really interesting to see the reactions to this particular depth chart. I think there's been people on sort of all sides of this in ways that I think reinforce how little we really know about what this team is and what they can be. And it's going to be interesting to kind of get to the end of the year and see who was able to actually read the tea leaves best with this team versus, people sort of letting their biases and memories of last year, or 2 years ago or whatever, run away with themselves and all of that. But, there's some people who the response to this depth chart was, oh my gosh, man, things are so thin. This is a 6-6 team. If that, I mean, this team, there's just no talent. It's amazing. And then you've got other people who are fairly encouraged to see this depth chart. And as for me, I wonder to some degree what people expected. I mean, I keep an in-house for myself projected depth chart going all year at all times in a Google Sheets document, right? So when I got this, the first thing I did is compare it to what I had and what I expected, and almost all of it was the same. There were a few places where some questions that I had about, okay, are they going to put him there or there? And is that guy going to be ahead of this guy? There are a few of those where I had some questions about where a guy would line up or exactly how they would arrange the depth chart, particularly on defense. But for the most part, things lined up exactly as I expected. And so I wonder, what did people expect? They're looking at this and going, oh my gosh, that defensive line looks so thin. Guys, it's the same players that you knew they had before. What did you expect? I mean, we've kind of known what the talent situation is. The question was how they would employ it, and have some of the guys that they brought in, have some of those guys demonstrated enough to go out and win jobs, and have the guys that you would expect and that you would hope to go out and win those jobs, have they won those jobs? So to me, I look at this and I mean, I guess it's probably not surprising to most of you that I looked at it and I kind of come out with a glass slightly more than half full outcome of this for a couple reasons. On the offensive side, the depth chart was basically identical to what anybody would have expected as far as the actual starters. I mean, it's what we thought. Tommy Castellanos at quarterback, Roydell Williams or Gavin Sawchuk as the lead running back, which in the opener against Alabama is what you expect. I think Chroma is going to be the guy that probably ends up taking over by the end of the year. But against Alabama, do you really want to put a true freshman out there on play one to be the guy? Probably not. Then Jalen Lucas as the all-purpose guy backed up by Chroma, right? Randy Pittman starting at tight end. And maybe the closest thing to an upset here is Amari Williams being listed as the number 2 there in an or situation with Landon Thomas. Okay, that's actually not that surprising given the buzz out of camp and also what we saw from him last year and also Thomas last year. So, okay. Deuce Robinson starting at one wide receiver, completely expected. Squirrel Wright at another receiver, completely expected. The real questions were about their backups, and you get Gavin Blackwell backing up Deuce Robinson. Okay, that's fine. And Mekhi Danzy being the main backup behind Squirrel White actually to me is encouraging because that suggests that he's really taking to that. And with the kind of speed that he has in a Gus Malzahn offense, Squirrel White is your speed merchant at that two wide receiver. Danzy's faster than him. So if Squirrel for some reason isn't on the field, if Danzy's the next guy there, you're still looking at a guy that can cause some serious headaches for coordinators just with speed. Then the other was Javen Boggs at the other wide receiver. Again, expected based on what we had seen and the intel that had come out. Maybe the other upset there, the only other upset here on the depth chart on the offensive side is Chase Lofton, the freshman tight end / wide receiver, being listed as the backup to another true freshman, Boggs, at that spot, and Lofton really lining up more at wide receiver than at tight end. But if you think about it, the tight end room is loaded. So how's Lofton going to get on the field? Well, flex him out more. So he and Boggs become more of the flexed wide receiver kind of role, and Lofton becomes a guy that when they go 2 and 3 tights, sometimes he's going to be on the field as that flex guy. You can go bigger with him. Okay, fine. And then the offensive line, they are who we thought they'd be. And the good thing is you got all the way through camp with a healthy group of your best offensive linemen. Gunnar Hansen, Richie Leonard, Jacob Rizzi, Luke Pettibon, Adrian Medley, and Micah Pettis. What we did learn is Adrian Medley is the backup right tackle in addition to being your main right guard. And so, if Pettis goes down, which again, knock on wood, you don't want to see that happen. It's very important that they stay as healthy as possible up front. Then Medley flexes out and Rizzi becomes the right guard. It's pretty simple. And it just shows they've got 6 guys that they really believe in as starter level players. And then the other guys are that are behind them are Lucas Simmons, Otto, Chavez Thompson, Sandman there, and Jonathan Daniels. So, I mean, that's all what we expected. Why be surprised here? And I think offensively, you can be pretty good with this group. I mean, I was talking to somebody the other day. I think this is probably the best offensive line personnel-wise in terms of starters that Mike Norvell has had at Florida State. You go back through the list, go back through every offensive line that he's had. Personnel-wise, this is the best group, the best first group that he's had. And honestly, if you go down the list, you probably have 4 guys on this that start on every Mike Norvell team up to now. So it's not just that they're better as a unit. I think they've got 4 guys on this offensive line that are better than any of the other guys so far in Mike Norvell's time at Florida State have been at their position. Pettis would start at right tackle on any Norvell team. I think Gunnar Hansen probably starts at left tackle on every Mike Norvell team. I think Adrian Medley starts at right guard on pretty close to, if not every Mike Norvell team, and Pettibon is by far the best center that they've had. So, that all bodes well. I mean, those are all good signs that they made it through camp with those guys all playing. And yeah, defensively, they come in with a true 3-3 depth chart. So, okay, not that surprising. And looking at where guys line up, you got James Williams at one end, Darrell Jackson at nose tackle, and Jason Jenkins at the other end. The fact that Jason Jenkins is actually ready to roll and is full strength and is in the starter role, to me, that's a great sign. If he stays healthy, this defense is very different because I think he's a difference maker for you. And really, you've got 3 guys there that I think are all legitimate pass rushers at least. Question is how well James Williams is going to hold up run-wise, because when he was at Nebraska, he really didn't have that responsibility. But I think overall, you look at those 3, and there's a chance of all 3 being disruptive and really good players. Okay. Behind them, Jaden Jones, Daniel Lyons, and Deontay McCray or Mandrell Desir. You know at least what you got in Daniel Lyons. Not dominant, not great, but probably pretty good as a backup. You're probably going to have some, a pretty significant step down from Jackson there. Jaden Jones is a bit of a mystery, but, the reports out of camp on him were excellent. Who knows? The talent was never a problem, never a question with him. The question was the knees. He had multiple ACL tears. If he's actually what he might be talent-wise, he actually might be pretty good there. And then the real question is behind Jason Jenkins, Deontay McCray, Mandrell Desir, what are you getting there? I mean, there's some thinness for sure. You'd like to see more depth and more defined, clear, high floor quality there. But I also think there's some names that are not on this depth chart that are probably going to play. And I also think that the guys that are on this depth chart are on there for a reason. And that brings us to some of these other names. I mean, you got AJ Cottrell and Donnie Hebert that are guys that are on this list as former walk-ons, and guys are going, what are they doing on? Look, there's a reason that some of the more highly recruited guys, some of the transfers that they brought in are not on this list. And it's a good reason. It's because those guys didn't earn their spot. And this coaching staff on the defensive side has decided to emphasize that you're going to have to play physical, you're going to have to play hard, or you're not playing. And that was the primary problem the last year, was that you had guys that flat out disrespected their defensive coordinator, dismissed and blew him off, and knew that they'd play anyway. You had guys that you had guys telling their coaches, I make more than you, so you shut the blank up and I'm going to do what I want, period. And that ain't happening with this group. What I do expect out of this group, and you got those 3 on the defensive front, backed by Justin Cryer, Elijah Herring, and Omar Graham at the jack position, which I think is really actually a great spot for him. He looked very good in pass rush moving forward toward the ball in high school and also at different points when he's done that at Florida State. This could be a really good role for him. You got those guys at linebacker. You got Rawls, Little, Barker, Joseph, and Wilson, along with an or with KJ Kirkland and Edwin Joseph, which is a bit of a surprise. But you look at those guys in the secondary and Shaheem Brown being a backup. You look at some of what you're seeing signaled here. There were some messages sent here. And they're the kind of messages that need to be sent, given what we saw last year, which was a listless, low-effort defense that was content to just be out there and cash a paycheck. What they did with this group is they're basically saying it doesn't matter what you're getting paid. What matters is whether you're going to play at the level that we're going to demand. And some of those guys haven't stepped up to that point. That's a bit discouraging in that respect. But the fact that that's not being tolerated and those guys aren't being trotted out there just because they're returning starters or because they were highly recruited or because they're more talented as freshmen or whatever, that's not happening. The other thing, by the way, is look at all the freshmen on this list. They hit on some guys in this class. It's really the first class that they've hit at this level in terms of guys being able to step right in. So to me, there's more positive than negative in terms of what we see once you adjust for what you already knew was on the roster. All right. So that brings us back. That brings us back to talking about that Alabama opener. Now, we're not going to spend much time on this. Like I said, I think anybody who's handicapping this game is going to favor Alabama by a reasonable amount. I think that's, it stands to reason. They're more talented across the board. They've got fewer question marks, and, they're expected to have one of the best offensive lines in the country. I think you could make a case they've got a top 3 wide receiver group. You look at what they've got in terms of Ryan Williams, probably the number 2 wide receiver in the country after, what the freak that is at Ohio State. And I've talked about this before. More important to have a good number 1 or a great number 1 than to have, 4 or 5 pretty good ones. They've got a great number 1. Real question comes down to quarterback and also whether or not they're going to be willing to be patient and run the football against a Florida State defense that they need to be able to run it against. I actually think this is going to be a closer game. I think you're going to see something closer to what you saw in 2021 against Notre Dame than an outright beatdown by Alabama in this one. And the reason for that is I think if you look at Gus Malzahn and his history in these big games and what he's done to Alabama, what he did to Alabama when Saban was there, they're going to find ways to generate some big play opportunities. There will be some big play opportunities, and they're going to be able to run the football in key spots in ways that will be frustrating for Alabama despite all that talent. And I think they've got the offensive line to be able to run the football some. And once you get enough of a push rushing wise, Malzahn's going to be able to find some cheap ways to get some big plays. And if they actually hold on to the football, if they actually execute a couple of those big play type situations, that's a ball game into the fourth quarter. And I do think the Alabama game is going to be a ball game into the fourth quarter. So I won't go much further than that. I'm going to give right now in my win shares for the season, I'm going to give Florida State a 35% chance of beating Alabama in this game, which is a lot higher than what you're getting from like the FPI, which is just under 10%. And some of these others. But I think, styles make fights, and this is going to be a really interesting stylistic fight in terms of what Florida State's going to bring in and what Alabama's going to bring in. We'll talk more about that later in the week. But it's time to get to the remainder of the schedule. Follow with East Texas A&M. That's a win. Kent State, also a win. I don't think that this is going to be a team that's going to pull a Jacksonville State against either of those teams, partly because, again, I think this team's going to be able to run the football. The real concern, maybe the biggest concern for me coming into this season, is essentially this team having the 2017 thing happened to them, where you have a DeAndre Francois go down in that opener, a couple other key guys get hurt, and the season collapses simply because you got key players that you couldn't afford to lose. Those guys go down in the opener, in a physical opener against Alabama, and then you can't recover. That's the worst case scenario. But if they come out of the Alabama game reasonably unscathed in terms of injuries and all that, then they march through East Texas A&M, they march through Kent State without too much difficulty, and then they get to Virginia. And you got to think about this from Mike Norvell's perspective. Alabama is a nothing to lose type game. As long as you are physical and you play hard and you look better than you did last year, that's a no lose situation. If you go out there and you win that game, all of a sudden everything changes for you for the season. Everything changes in terms of the way that your team thinks about itself and everything else. All of a sudden, we're back, we're off the snide, back in the saddle kind of situation. That's how you're thinking of it. But you're also thinking about it as it's a no lose situation, because even if you do go out and you lose that game, it doesn't impact you in conference. And all of the other realistic goals of your season are still there. So in some ways, you can learn a lot about your team in that Alabama game, almost like a preseason game. It's a game that counts, but it's not a game that is, everything for your program. And so what you do is you use that Alabama game. You learn a lot about who's going to play and who's not in that game. Then you spend the next two games as preseason games, where you find out more about your team and you improve and you're getting better through the first month of the season. And that sets you up for at Virginia on the road, Friday, 7 p.m. game. And presumably you're 2-1. If things sort of went crazy well for you in that opener, then you're 3-0. But you're 2-1 going into the Virginia game. And I think that's a bad Virginia team. And frankly, I think it's very possible, almost likely, that this is a year that just given that Virginia roster, given that Virginia schedule, Virginia, I'm not sure Tony Elliott's going to be there at the end of the year. Now, Virginia is going to be coming off Coastal Carolina at NC State, Bill and Mary, and Stanford at home against Stanford in their first month. So they're probably 3-1 or 2-2 coming into this, and they're okay. And they won't be reeling, but I'm not sure that they're a really good football team. I don't think that they're one that you don't have more talent than on both lines of scrimmage. The thing that's scary about them is I do think that Chandler, their quarterback, is a guy that can get hot. And the one thing that is the concern about what White is going to do defensively is they are going to focus on stopping the run. They're going to do all sorts of different things to provide different looks and all of that. But because they do more spot drop type zone stuff rather than true pattern matching, if you run into a red hot quarterback, that can be really, really tough. They could give up some yards. So against some of those teams, White's going to have to go more true man, do some of those things because they don't do as much pattern matching and all of that. So, if Chandler goes crazy, then Virginia becomes dangerous. But I think Florida State's going to be able to run the football and stop the run. And I think that Virginia game is likely a win. I've got that at an 85% chance of winning. And then you go into the Miami game. And here's the thing. Home against Miami this year, after that first month, where you've got an Alabama game that by that point you'll have flushed. By that point, you'll know who you are as a team. And if you can come out at 3-1 going into Alabama or going into Miami, the Miami game becomes really the game that sets the table and sort of establishes what kind of season this is going to be for you as a Florida State team. Not only are they one of your two biggest rivals, this is a home game where it's the first opportunity to really display, okay, what are you going to be over the course of the season in a game where there's stakes that are a little bit different. This isn't a no win or no lose situation. This is where there's real stakes. Miami, on the other hand, though, Miami is in an interesting spot. I think this is one where the way the schedule shakes up makes this game a lot more interesting because Miami opens hosting Notre Dame, and I think that Notre Dame team, by the way, is better than Miami. What happens, just put a hypothetical on the table for you here. What happens if Miami loses the opener to Notre Dame? Then they get Bethune-Cookman. They'll beat Bethune. Then they got South Florida. They'll beat South Florida. That South Florida team, has some possibility of giving a little bit of a challenge there. And then they host Florida. So that first month, you got Notre Dame, Bethune, South Florida, and then Florida. And it's entirely possible if DJ Lagway is what Florida people think he actually is going to be this year, and if Florida is what all the folks around Gainesville think they're going to be, and some pundits think they're going to be, it's entirely possible that Florida goes in and beats Miami. And then you got a 2-2 Miami team reeling, and now they're going to get a bye between Florida and Florida State. But they might be 2-2 at that point. And if there's one thing we know about Miami teams, that have all the temptations of South Beach and everything else, and this is a Miami team that is loaded with transfers, with a bunch of mercenaries, including a quarterback that at Georgia, they weren't real sorry to see leave, leadership-wise. What happens if they go out and they lose that opener, they lose to Florida, and they come into Florida State 2-2, and Florida State's playing them potentially at, say, 3-1 at home, gaining some confidence after a road win against Virginia? What happens there? Now, let's just say that, Miami wins one of those two. Both of those are closer to coin flip games. So maybe it's 1 out of 2. So they come in at 3-1. Either way, I think this is a game that is going to be a war. And I do think with what Florida State does defensively, they're going to be better equipped to try to face a lot of what Miami wants to do offensively than they have been. They're going to focus on stopping the run. Miami's going to try to establish the run. Miami's offensive line is excellent. They're big. Florida State's going to put their guys out there to try to close that down. And I think this is going to be one of those physical, traditional Florida State-Miami games where the team that runs the football for more yards wins the game. And honestly, with Gus Malzahn and Tommy Castellanos and the offensive line that they have, I think this is closer to a coin flip than the actual talent levels across the board on the teams might suggest, especially since, again, Florida State has some true wide receiver threats that are big play guys. So I'm going to go with this as a 50-50 game, 0.5 against Miami. I'm much more optimistic about this game, I know, than virtually anybody else who's doing this analysis. But I'm just looking at this and I'm going with who Miami will have played, with what I think of their quarterback and their leadership situation, and some of the places where I just don't think this Miami team is quite the same as when they had Ward and some of the guys that were there offensively. I do think there's probably going to be a step forward defensively, but I think Florida State's going to have some answers baked in terms of the running game and in terms of the ability to generate some big plays that are going to make things difficult. Again, styles make fights, and Florida State's style this year is going to be a really interesting matchup for that Miami team. I'm saying this is a 0.5. Then you got Pitt at home. I'll say 0.65. Pitt's going to be Pitt. They've got some quality. They've got some promise at quarterback. They're always physical. They're always tough. But again, I think talent-wise and in terms of style, Florida State matches up pretty well here. I'm going to go with 0.65. Then you get at Stanford at 10:30 on the road, 10:30 at night, Eastern time. That's always bad. You don't want to be Pac-12 after dark. There's a reason for the wild, wild west messes that have happened out there. You got to be a lot better than the team you're facing because, they're dragging you out into their late nights. But I think that's a really bad Stanford team. They're on a 1-year interim coach. Their roster really got raided a bunch, and I think by this point in the year, they're really struggling. I think Florida State 0.85 there. I like that matchup for Florida State, even though it's a late night game. Then you get a bye. Then you get home Wake Forest, 0.85. I think, again, that's a bad Wake Forest team. Clawson resigning late, actually, in the offseason. And I think you feel pretty comfortable there. Then you go on the road to Clemson. That's a really good Clemson team. And I'll talk about this at the end of the show, but I think this Clemson team they're probably my front runner to win the national title this year. They're right there to me with Texas, Notre Dame, and Ohio State, maybe Penn State, as national title favorites. And I think in terms of matchups, again, styles make fights. Some of the matchups there, I think, are ugly for Florida State. Clemson has, I think, the best defensive line in the country. At least their starters are. And I think they're going to be the best equipped team in the country to stop Florida State's run game, or at least on the schedule to stop Florida State's run game. And then you combine that with Klubnik and the wide receiver. They finally have Clemson-style wide receivers again for the first time in a while, and a senior quarterback to be able to pull the trigger there. That's going to be a really good Clemson team. I'm going to go 0.2, 20% chance that you beat Clemson. I think Clemson beats Florida State pretty heavily there, pretty soundly. Then you get Virginia Tech, licking your wounds on that one. I'm going to go with 0.75 here. Again, I don't think Virginia Tech is going to be especially great this year. I think it's entirely possible that we may see a coach get fired at the end of the year. We'll see. I also don't think that they're going to be great throwing the football, which I think is how you're going to have to beat this Florida State defense as often as not. Whereas Clemson with Klubnik and those receivers, I think they're going to be able to find daylight with an experienced quarterback and some number one wide receivers, really two guys that could be number one receivers just about anywhere. And I think they're going to be a team that's going to be able to cause problems. They're going to be able to stop the run, I think even better than an Alabama. And that also being on the road in Death Valley, that's a problem. Virginia Tech doesn't have those things in their favor. And I'm going to go with 0.75. I think Virginia Tech, they're going to be more of a run-heavy team. I think that plays into what White's defense is going to stop really well. Then you get the Friday night at NC State obligatory trap game before Florida. This is a really dangerous game. Basically a coin flip. I'm going to go 0.6. I think NC State has some reasons to be really dangerous here, but I do think their roster is pretty thin. We'll see what they are by the end of the year. But I'm going to go 0.6. I think you compare the rosters, sort of compare the depth, compare the kinds of programs that they're likely to be this year. Slight favorite to Florida State there. And then you get at Florida. And here we go. At Florida. What is Florida going to be this year? Will Lagway be healthy by the end of the year? We don't know. There's a bunch of unknowns. It's a rivalry game. By the end of the year, I think this is pretty close. This is starting to get to coin flip territory in this kind of throw out the record book game, but I cannot favor Florida State over Florida at this point in the season. I think Florida's got more depth on the line of scrimmage. I think you've got to favor Lagway at quarterback. If he's healthy, give a pretty significant edge to Florida. So I'm going to go 0.4, and that might actually be overstating it a little bit, but I do think there is a chance based on, again, Billy likes to try to bludgeon teams, run the rock and all that. I think there's going to be opportunities to try to get stops there by taking control of the line of scrimmage with what White does defensively. I think Florida's likely to have just a little bit too much in terms of depth. And again, Lagway there for Florida State to get the win, but I wouldn't be surprised. Again, we're talking months from now. Who knows what's going to happen between now and then. So what does that all add up to? Well, interestingly, when you add up my percentages, it comes out to 8.0 and 4.0. Florida State going 8-4. Which, looking at this schedule, makes a lot of sense. So I've done this in the past. Last year, it was kind of a disaster because the significant edge, coin flip, should win stuff. None of that really made any sense once we actually got to see what that team was and how hard they didn't play. But when we start to look at rosters, we start to look at matchups and other things, we can kind of divide the season into these categories based on what we can expect going into each of these games. And I think Florida State plays in 5 games where they have a significant talent and just general organizational edge. And that is East Texas A&M, Kent State, at Stanford, Wake Forest, and at Virginia. I think those games are games that Florida State really should win at more than a, say, 70% clip. That's 5 games that I would expect Florida State to win all 5. Then there's the should win category. This is a category where it's not quite a coin flip, but the edge is not high enough where you would be surprised if it went the other way. To me, that's Virginia Tech and Pitt. These are games Florida State should win. But if they don't, it's not a surprise. Virginia Tech and Pitt. So that's 2 there. Then you have 3 that I'm putting in the coin flip category. And 2 of them, I know a bunch of you are going to say they do not belong in this category. But to me, given what I think in terms of the styles make fights and matchups and where they fall in the schedule, that's just how I see them. And what I mean by coin flip is 60-40 or closer in terms of likelihood of winning or losing. And that's at NC State, at Florida, and Miami, Florida. Those 3 games, I think, are effectively coin flip games. And then you have the likely losses. These are games where the other team is better than you. They've got a better roster. They've got fewer question marks. They should probably beat you by more than a 60% likelihood. To me, that's Clemson, who is a lot better than you, and Alabama, who should be better than you, but there's more questions with. So let's just say you take 2 L's in the likely losses. Now, interesting, when we look at past likely losses, Florida State has outperformed in some of those games. But you look at those likely losses, you take the losses against Clemson and Alabama. Let's say you win 1 of the coin flip games, then you're already at 8-4. Then you have to win both should win games and all of your significant edge games to get to 8-4. So to me, when I look at this schedule, I think it's most likely that they wind up about 8-4. 7-5 is very realistic. That if for some reason a couple of the guys go down that you really need, and they're thin on the offensive line, there's some thin situations on the defensive line. If Tommy Castellanos goes down, it's disaster. There's a bunch of those pieces where if something like that happens at some point in the schedule, you adjust down from 8 to 7 to potentially 6. I think that's kind of where you are. I think sort of ground zero is somewhere 7.5, 8 wins. Now, a lot of that's just schedule based. If this team played an average schedule, then this is an 8 or 9 win team, potentially a 10 win team. If this team played North Carolina schedule, I think it's a 10-2 or 11-1 team. But they don't. They play a schedule where a top 15 team is probably going to go 8-4. And I think this is probably going to be a top 20-ish, top 25 quality team from Florida State. The question is, how high is that ceiling? To me, the ceiling is they stay healthy on the offensive line, Castellanos stays healthy, and they're able to stay reasonably healthy on the defensive line. And if they can put that together, then I think there's enough potential difference makers that they could potentially outdo 8-4. They potentially pull an upset or 2 against a Florida or Miami or an Alabama, and they beat the teams that they ought to beat otherwise. 9-3 is not out of the question. I would not be shocked if this team went 10-2. I would be surprised if they went 11-1. I think 10-2 is probably your on the fringe of realistic ceiling for this team. I think 6-6 is around your floor. I say that with trepidation because nobody thought the floor was at 2 wins last year. But I think a lot would have to happen for this team to go below 6-6. And I think a lot of positives would have to happen in order for them to go, 9-3, 10-2 against this schedule. But I do think that Miami game is potentially gettable. I think even that Alabama game is maybe a little more gettable than people think, because of all the uncertainty and what you can kind of expect from Malzahn and Norvell in an opener, and some of the things that we saw from Alabama last year. So that makes this a very, very interesting season with a whole lot of questions and a lot of uncertainty. if nothing else, I think one thing we will be grateful to see is that we will at least not be forced to watch. And for those of us who actually cover this stuff, we are forced to watch. For those of you who are fans, I don't know how you kept watching what we saw last year once it became obvious that that team wasn't interested in playing hard. If nothing else, I think this year's Florida State team gives you a bunch of guys you can root for and a bunch of guys that are going to play hard, they're going to play physical, and they're actually guys that you don't feel bad rooting for. There were people on the inside that I talked to last year who just and I talked about this last year as well, who just flat out said, like, man, when you're around these guys, this is a hard team to like. These guys are just really unlikable. And I think this group is very different from that. I think if nothing else, this is a likable group that you can root for, that are going to play hard. And when they lose, they're going to lose sort of on the limitations of their talent and their depth, maybe fatigue, and, just getting outclassed. But you know what? I'll take a team that fights for every inch and fights to the last breath, and then fails over a team that has lots of talent and just isn't interested in going out there and doing it. Last year was the latter. This year, I think you're going to see somebody that's a lot more fun to watch, even when they do lose. So the last thing I want to do here is go through some national stuff. Look at what we can kind of expect coming into this year. And again, this is a more wide open year than there has been in a while. But what do we actually see happening? Who do we see potentially making the playoff, winning the national title, all of that? Who wins each conference and all of that? So I'm going to take my stab at this here at the end of the show, so that the rest of you will have something to send to freezing cold takes and make fun of me at the end of the year, as surely most of this winds up being wrong, given a very unpredictable year. But I'm going to take a crack at it. So a few things I'm going to say. First of all, there are a few teams that I think are going to be a good bit better than a lot of other people seem to think, and then the ratings seem to think. One of them is Clemson. I think Clemson is legitimately one of the best teams in the country. I look at, for example, the Football Power Index, or the SEC Power Index, if you want to call them that, from ESPN, and they've got Clemson down at 16th coming into the season, just ahead of Miami of Florida and SMU, and behind Florida at 13. I'm much less bullish on Florida. I don't think they're quite that. They should be quite that high. I'm significantly more bullish on Clemson. And by the way, how unlucky is Brian Kelly to open with Clemson this year after basically, I mean, think about that guy. He has had to open with Florida State twice and get beat by Florida State twice when Florida State was peaking. Then now he's got to open with Clemson. This guy can't catch a break in these openers. But LSU is actually 12th in the FPI. I don't think that they beat Clemson in that opener, and I don't think that they end up, finishing in the top 3 in the SEC either. I think there's going to wind up being some unrest in Baton Rouge after this season, maybe even before the end of the season. Kelly's a good coach. I'm just not sure how patient they're going to be there. And I'm not sure I see a team that goes out and runs the football and stops the run well enough to have the success that they expect to have this year, given all that they've invested. Pat Payton, by the way, running second team there. Interesting, huh? So for me, I'm more bullish on Clemson. I'm not as bullish on Miami of Florida, that is. I'm a little bit less bullish on SMU than some. FPI has them at 18. A lot of people have them, as the number 2 team in the ACC. I'm more bullish on Georgia Tech. I think Georgia Tech, schedule wise, has a schedule that sets up for them to go maybe as high as 10-2, but 9-3 range, totally plausible to me for Georgia Tech. Wouldn't be surprised to see the ACC title game be Clemson versus Georgia Tech. Wouldn't surprise me at all. I think their schedule, like I said, sets up really well. If they're able to essentially recover from a couple of the key losses they had with some of the playmakers that they lost, Singleton in particular, I think they're going to be pretty good. That's a very well coached team, if nothing else. Another team I'm higher on than most, Notre Dame. I think, again, they're a very well coached football team. They're going to be very, very tough defensively. They'll stop both the run and the pass. They're going to tackle. They're going to be detailed. They're going to handle the little things well. I think that Notre Dame team goes deep into the playoff. I'll just go ahead and say it. If I had to pick today for the two teams that I would have as most likely to make the college football playoff finals, the final game, the championship game, I'm going Notre Dame against Clemson. Now, I think I might favor Clemson there, but that's the game I wouldn't be surprised to see. In the SEC, I think the class of the conference is Texas and Georgia. But the third team that I think is going to go up there and maybe surprise some people is Oklahoma. I think Oklahoma is going to be a real problem for teams this year. They started to turn the corner defensively last year. They added a few more pieces, and Venables has not forgotten how to coach defense. They will suffocate some teams this year defensively. And with the combination that they brought in terms of offensive coordinator, quarterback, and running back, adding Jaden Ott from California, where he was hurt a good portion of last year, but that's a top 5 or so, 6 running back in the country that they just added. And then they added Mateer with his offensive coordinator. So he's coming in already knowing the system that they're running and a few other pieces. I think that Oklahoma team they're a sneaky good bet to potentially win the SEC. You look at what the odds makers actually have on that. If there was a team I was going to, lay $100 on to maybe win the SEC in the opening weeks, just based on, potentially making a decent amount on it, I think OU is probably your bet. Now, Texas and Georgia, like I said, probably the class of the conference. Talent-wise, those are, I think, the two most talented teams, along with Ohio State and Alabama. Those are your 4 most talented teams in the country. Ohio State has some questions, though, as well. But I think they're the likely Big Ten champs. I think Penn State comes up short again. I think Ohio State has a few playmakers that Penn State just doesn't have. So I think Ohio State winds up winning the Big Ten, but doesn't win a national title. And I think essentially your best 4 end of the year might be Texas, OU, Notre Dame, and Clemson. As far as the Big 12, I don't think it matters that much because none of those teams is gonna really legitimately be a contender. But give me maybe Iowa State in the Big 12. I think I think Arizona State's also going to be really good again. But I'm gonna go with Iowa State actually breaking through and getting their first conference title in 111 years or whatever it is. By the way, that OU Michigan game is going to be a game worth watching, and for X's and O's junkies, I will say I'm going to be really interested in that one. Looking forward to getting the all 22 of that one. In the ACC, again, I think it's Clemson. Wouldn't be surprised to see Georgia Tech be the team that plays them in the ACC championship game. I do think Florida State is a bit of a dark horse there because of that schedule. They beat Miami. The only other really top level team in the ACC they play is Clemson. So that Miami game could turn the season in that respect. That you get past Miami and all of a sudden Florida State's in the running to potentially make the ACC title game. We'll see though. Whole bunch of interesting stuff there. Like I said, I've got Ohio State winning the Big Ten, followed by Oregon ahead of Penn State. And then we'll say Texas and Georgia once again in the ACC title game. It's really hard for me not to have OU there. I think OU is a very close sort of 1C in the SEC. But I'm going to go with Notre Dame and Clemson as my 2 most likely to make it, partly because they're the most likely to get there. I think Notre Dame's schedule sets up for that. They're going to be in the playoff. And I think Clemson is going to be in the playoff. There are a bunch of these other teams that they have to actually make it through a little bit more, and they're probably going to have a little harder time to guarantee being in the playoff. Though I think Texas and Georgia and Ohio State and perhaps Alabama have some mulligans that they can handle on that anyway. But we'll go with that for the national preview. I'm not even going to take a shot at the Heisman. I don't think it'll be Arch Manning, but who knows? That name may carry. We'll see. It's going to be a fun year. Looking forward to it. It's been an hour-long preview. I think that's pretty much where I'm going to tap out for the night. This has been Unconquered with Doc Staples. I'm your host, Doc Staples. Thanks for listening. If you've been enjoying this podcast, please leave a 5-star rating over at Apple Podcasts and wherever else you listen to podcasts. Post and repost episodes on social media and tell a friend. And if you haven't left a review in a while, do it again. It really does help the visibility of the podcast. Before we go, I'd also like to thank my advertising partners once more. That's EPR Creations, Luis Marquez of Momentum Realty in Jacksonville, Florida, Shenandoah Real Estate in the Research Triangle of North Carolina, Garage Makeovers, the #1 garage remodeling company in South Florida, and Justin Galloway of Benchmark Mortgage, serving Florida, Tennessee, and Kentucky. You can also stop by the Unconquered Shop at unconqueredpodcast.com, where you can buy stickers, pins, magnets, t-shirts, and other swag. I am especially grateful for those of you at the Dynasty level. That is Brian Leininger, Dave Blair, Jack Horton, Jonathan Kennedy, Lee Caswell, Travis Smith, and Tyler Kashishki. You all are far more generous than I deserve. Thanks to you all. This has been Unconquered with Doc Staples. I'm your host, Jason Staples. Thanks for listening, and thanks for your support. I made this.